few days ago, I made a coronavirus lockdown video. In it, I explained how our freedoms are being eroded by petty tyrants that have used this opportunity to seize power at the expense of the civilian population. I would like to share with you some history behind that sentiment. That is to say, that George Washington himself, the most prominent founder of our country, was afflicted with numerous ailments over the course of his lifetime, both things that he spontaneously developed and contagions that he was around. In addition, members of his family had died from ailments. That comes into that comes into play when you consider that one of the major framers of the Constitution was well aware with the personal consequences that any sort of contagion or spontaneously developed illness can have on a society. But let's read on. So the first article that I have here for you today is history, found over at mountvernon.org. This gives a pretty concise overview of everything that George Washington had went through in his life, at least as it pertains to medical issues. But first, before we get into the article, if you like what I say, if you like what I do, please like, share, subscribe, ring that stupid little bell. And if you're thinking to yourself, hey, this guy's awesome, how can I tell him to shut up and take my money? Well, you're in luck. That information is in the description. There's a PayPal option, a Venmo option, a crypto option. But let's move on. George Washington was often concerned he would die young. His father died at 48, and his favorite sibling, Lawrence, was only in his early 30s when he passed away. Many of Washington's siblings died even younger than Lawrence, including his sister Mildred, who was 3.5, I guess, years old, sister Jane, who lived about 12 years. During the 18th century, men of Washington's class lived on average to their late 40s or early 50s, whereas women were at much greater risk due to pregnancy and often did not live as long. To try and prevent an early death, Washington exercised, ate and drank moderately, attempted to get enough sleep, and avoided tobacco. Even with those healthy habits, Washington was afflicted with a number of serious illnesses, but he did live to be 67. George Washington was aware of all of the risks, all of the pains of death, and everything in between. So what he did was he took personal responsibility. He said, hey, this stuff is known to cause me trouble. It will make me fat. It will make me unwell. I'll hack up a lung. And so he just didn't do it, or he exercised. Whatever it took to mitigate the dangers. He was proactive in protecting his own life as a choice. Medicine during the 18th century was significantly different from today. Germs, infections, diseases, and the importance of sanitation were not understood, which often meant that only symptoms were treated. Injuries or illnesses that could seem minor today could easily result in death. Washington tried to educate himself on health and medicine. In his library at the time of his death, there were 9 medical books. He also ordered a number of drugs to try and self-medicate for whatever medicinal value these things here on the screen provided. Washington frequently ordered bark, which came from the bark of a cinchoncha tree and was used to treat fevers. Bark became a favorite of Washington to treat malarial fevers, which he experienced many times. Washington described smallpox as a potentially greater threat than the sword of the enemy. Historically, it killed over a quarter of those infected. Smallpox was typically transported to 18th century America via immigrants and enslaved people. Unlike in Europe, the majority of the American population lived relatively isolated lives on farms and plantations. Outside of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, there was little chance of getting the disease, and prior to 1747, there were no smallpox epidemics in Virginia. Washington was one of the few Virginians exposed to smallpox prior to the American Revolution. He and his half-brother Lawrence visited Barbados in 1751 to try and ease Lawrence's tuberculosis. Not long after arriving, the brothers visited Lawrence's uncle, Gedney Clark. Washington was hesitant to go since Miss Clark was suffering from smallpox. Just a couple of weeks later, Washington noted he had been strongly attacked with the smallpox. For 3 weeks, Washington was bedridden and treated by local physician Dr. John Lanham. Washington's exposure to the disease meant he was immune from smallpox for the rest of his life, which was imperative during the American Revolution. So again, Washington was not only around tuberculosis, which is a highly communicable disease, he was himself afflicted with smallpox, which left him bedridden for nearly a month. Washington became very sick during the French and Indian War while serving as aide-de-camp to Britain General Edward Braddock. Washington became very sick during the French and Indian War while serving as aide-de-camp to British General Edward Braddock. In June 1755, Washington wrote his brother saying he had contracted dysentery. The pain was so severe that Washington had to travel laying down in a wagon. About 2 weeks later, he was recovering as Braddock's forces reached Fort Duquesne. Washington attempted to mount a horse and ride to the front. However, he found it too painful and had to strap on cushions to ride. Washington fought through the pain, and when Braddock fell during battle, he took control. He had yet another sickness that he was dealing with, and he still found it within himself to ride into battle. Soon after his appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, Washington encouraged Congress to create a medical department within the Army. He also immediately had to deal with smallpox, which became more widespread during the war. Between 1775 and 1782, the disease killed at least 100,000 people. Soldiers arriving from England and Germany frequently brought the virus to America. Moreover, recruits from all over North America joined the Continental Army, and many who had never been exposed to smallpox suddenly were. And now we're getting into military service. And yes, there is a difference between uh, mandatory vaccinations for military and forcing lockdown on the civilian population. We'll get into that in a sec. Within days of taking command of the Army, Washington wrote to assure the President of the Continental Congress that he had been particularly attentive to the least symptoms of the smallpox, quarantining anyone suspected of having the disease. Washington further promised that he would continue the utmost vigilance against this dangerous enemy. Smallpox plagued the Continental Army as well as the civilian population, and epidemics broke out in major cities including Boston and Philadelphia. Washington believed in the effectiveness of inoculation and eventually instituted a system where new recruits were inoculated with smallpox immediately upon enlistment. That tradition actually carries forward to today. Inoculation involved deliberate exposure to smallpox, usually through an incision made in the arm. This still resulted in a case of smallpox, but usually with mild symptoms and a greater chance of survival, with immunity as the end goal. Many in colonial America opposed inoculation because it could cause an outbreak if the inoculated person was not properly quarantined while ill. Inoculation was heavily regulated and banned outright in some places. Combined with the procedure's expense, it was a rare practice in America. And I can tell you that even today, the smallpox vaccine, which actually creates a small culture of live smallpox on your arm, is something that you actually need to take a lot of care with. It summarizes this by saying that Washington faced many challenges as he inoculated his army, and that's absolutely true. The difference is that when you join the military, you are voluntarily giving up some of your rights and freedoms as it pertains to some of the things about your body in exchange for knowing that you're going to be doing a great service. That is a choice that you make. And while you may not have a say in every individual little thing that happens, you still go into this knowing what you're signing up for, whether it's potentially deploying or inoculations or what have you. By contrast, the civilian population makes no such contract with the government. Now, you could argue that there's a social contract, and that comes into personal responsibility more than actual direct orders. The rest of this article goes on to talk about George Washington's illnesses as he was president, but by that point, there's already a constitution, there's already a country, and that doesn't have anything to do with the framing, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that. But I implore you, go ahead and read the source, which is always in the description and always archived wherever possible. Before we head into the next article, take your frustrations out on these petty tyrants by heading over to facialabuse.com. That's facialabuse.com. That must be 18 years older to enter. CNSnews.com says, civil disobedience is about to make a bold comeback if Americans continue to be robbed of liberty and freedom by government's coronavirus crackdown, conservative commentator and former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino says. I tend to agree with that. Americans' freedoms are being flushed down the toilet, he warned Saturday in a Twitter post. Bongino's post links to a story of local officials removing a basketball hoop to stop a 12-year-old girl from shooting baskets all by herself in a small mountain suburb of Little Rock, Arkansas. The Daily Wire's Ash Show, I hope I pronounced that correctly, reports a 12-year-old girl was playing basketball alone on a court near her family's home when city officials arrived and removed the hoop as part of social distancing. They straight up jacked the basketball hoop. What the hell? The girl's mother, Laura Vandercook, wrote about the episode at the Federalist. She said her family lives on a small mountain in a suburb of Little Rock, Arkansas, which butts up against a city green space that includes a small basketball court. A court, she said, is fairly ignored. Can you imagine that? You're playing basketball out in the middle of nowhere with nobody else, and police just roll up and steal your hoop? What the hell's going on? Vandercook's daughter is not alone. As ABC News reports, a former police officer was recently arrested in front of his 6-year-old daughter for playing catch with her in a secluded area of a Colorado park. In an incident caught on video, a former Colorado State Patrol trooper said he was handcuffed in front of his 6-year-old daughter on a near-empty softball field Sunday by Brighton police officers enforcing social distancing rules. The department apologized Tuesday afternoon, calling the incident an overreach by our police officers. Matt Mooney, 33, told ABC News that when he walked with his wife and daughter from their home to a nearby park Sunday to play softball. We were just having a good time, not near anybody else. The next closest person is at least 15 feet away from me and my daughter at this point. After the incident, during national media coverage, the Brighton Police Department apologized for the overreach by our police officers. You need to actually ensure that your police officers know what they're doing. I've seen this a lot, even in the military. If you don't understand the scope of your power, if you don't understand the limits of it, you're going to act willy-nilly. And that's what we see here, and not just here, but in a lot of different scenarios where citizens just have a boot on their neck. But, all isn't lost. Sometimes it took a little bit longer than I would have liked, but there are people that are protesting this. Over in Ohio, the Dayton Daily News states, dozens of protesters Thursday afternoon gathered outside the Ohio State House where Governor Mike DeWine broadcast his daily press briefing on the coronavirus crisis. Protesters chanted, including one that said, OHIO, Acton's got to go. One of the videos that I saw online today said, we do not consent. That was the chant, just we do not consent, which I think is entirely appropriate because the state rules at the consent of the governed. DeWine said the protesters have a First Amendment right to say what they want, but his job is to communicate honestly and candidly to Ohio. I will guarantee you that we're not going to keep those orders on one day longer than we have to. What I'm asking Ohioans to do is hang in there. All the evidence that we have indicates if we don't hang in there, if we don't continue to do what we're doing, it's going to cost a lot of lives and it's going to delay our ability to economically recover. And while I think that's an appropriate thing to have guidelines for, you publish guidelines so people can make informed decision. The moment you take their ability to make the decision away, you're overstepping bounds. The protesters also had signs that said they don't consent to social distancing orders. One sign read, social distancing or social conditioning. Another said, Ohio dies when government lies. The demonstrators were not standing 6 feet apart. Ooh. Some were wearing Guy Fawkes masks and others patriotic bandanas to cover their faces. Dr. Amy Acton, director of the Ohio Department of Health, addressed some of the group's concerns in remarks, saying she understands people are fearful and adding Ohio is working on a recovery plan to get back to business. So there you have it. We have a small example of public disobedience, people not standing 6 feet apart, and also protesting in a relatively organized manner. Same time, same place. What I would say to do, in addition to any organized protest, is call up your senators and be like, hey, we need our rights. Why aren't you protecting us? Why are you locking us down? And I'm not saying go out and have a coronavirus party. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying people should not live in fear of the government's boot on their neck. So be adamant, but be respectful and make your voice known.